The NAFTA negotiations this time around were definitely very different, very intense. So that completely changed the game, I think, from the get-go. And we had a lot at stake. It was very clear that the U.S. administration had some goals that they wanted to achieve, and it was all about America. And so hence they changed their strategy a little bit. Instead of going with a tripartite negotiation, they struck off to create a bilateral with Mexico, presumably the rationale being to apply more pressure for Canada. Nonetheless, we ended up with something that actually strengthens, I think, the platform for trade across the industry in North America. Not an ideal, a treaty, but it's a treaty that certainly is more modernized, given how significantly the industry has changed over the last 25 years. And it allows us to move forward with some certainty. And that means for those of us, those companies who are looking at new investment, they now have a little bit more clarity on which to do that. We've got an agreement that could last for 16 years as opposed to the 5-year sunset clause. So there's no question that Canada, they stood their ground on some issues, and I think they were successful on some key issues, and that ultimately made a better deal for Canada. So we're pleased by that, and we're certainly encouraged with just how the government reached out to industry in the process. I mean, what they did in consulting with companies, understanding the issues was exemplary, and so we really commend them for that. You call it a trade wall, call it a trade war. Anytime you start, imposing tariffs, which can be a very effective means of getting the other party to bow down. That's what came forward here. And, we've already seen, for instance, in the steel and aluminum, which still exists, wasn't dealt with under the agreement, but we'll pursue it. You could already see very quickly through the supply chain and ultimately to the cost to the OEMs from a manufacturing perspective, that was going to raise prices. So not only the tariff was there, but then the U.S. steel industry itself started to raise prices. So the perversity of all that is that those U.S. companies and businesses were actually being negatively impacted by those trade tariffs themselves in the United States. Not what I would think is a well thought out policy, but not bad from a negotiating stance. And then the potential trade tariffs on autos, 25% for parts as well. That was probably not only intolerable policy weapon, if you will, against the industry, but it really would have been so deep. It would have struck so deep, I think, into what we do and how we sell our vehicles, how we build our vehicles. When you basically export 97% of your product into the United States, all of which would be subject to a 25% tariff, the cost to U.S. consumers would be such that nobody would buy our vehicles. And play it through, wind it back, the impact for manufacturing here would be devastating. And I think the U.S. administration knew that. Whether they ever intended to follow through, that remains to be, may not ever be understood, but it was never came to fruition, which was a very good thing. So we had a lot to lose here, and when you look at auto industry and manufacturing at 22% of manufacturing GDP in Ontario, that is without question what we call a cornerstone of the economy. Couldn't afford to lose it. We were very grateful that the Canadian government stood up and remained strong. The support from the Ontario government was also very helpful in reaching out to U.S. governors and so forth. And that's another part of that people didn't see, I think, was all of the work that went on behind the scenes between premiers, Ontario particularly, federal government with U.S. governors, with U.S. congressmen and women. These are all things that I think ultimately applied pressure on the U.S. government to ultimately come around and make some concessions. So again, that's something that we've been very thankful for. We've been through some scary times before, back in 2008. Some people even equated the results or the consequences of this as equivalent to 2008. So absolutely, I mean, the companies were doing their own due diligence on questions like how would you pass along the cost to consumers, for instance. I guess it really comes down to, okay, what's the supplier inputs, what's this input, that input, how much can you possibly absorb? How much is the consumer willing to absorb? These are all things from a retail perspective and marketing perspective people were thinking about. Then you mentioned, of course, the threat to the 150,000 direct jobs in Ontario, and then the direct and indirect across Canada. Ultimately, that involves all the dealerships and so forth. These are the roughly 700,000 or 800,000 other jobs across Canada. And one thing that's certain here is that if you lose investment, you're not likely to get it back. In Canada, I mean, we have some, Canadian-owned, some, biggest suppliers in the world right here. They got there for a reason, and they got there because they're astute business people, and they understand the auto industry, and ultimately they know how to diversify and establish a presence in many locations around the globe. So what we would probably see would have been a shift, for instance, as you suggest, to other jurisdictions, and how long Canadian plants could continue to service U.S. customers, that would remain to have been seen. Everybody was going through this process of what if, and making plans, business plans, accordingly. And then, of course, steel aluminum tariffs. These things, these tariffs have to be removed. I think the best outcome we have is that they're eliminated entirely. And I don't personally see any reason why the U.S. government would want to continue when they got a deal that they seem to be satisfied with. You know, when you look at the Windsor, Oshawa corridor, and when you look at not just, our 8 assembly plants and engine plants, component plants, then you've got all the suppliers in those communities as well. And, I don't think, any one of those companies, those OEM manufacturers, want to see the demise of any of any sort of plant. And they want to continue. They've got a huge investment here. We've got good skilled labor. We've got many reasons to stay here. If I had to sort of give a criticism of our industry, it's the fact that we don't do the best job at helping people across Canada understand the importance of the industry. I mean, think about what they hear. Well, they hear about industry asking for this or that, but which is absolutely, those supports are so critical for new investment. So I would say most don't, because once, the farther away you get from the center, the less people understand. That's something which we are constantly trying to do, is to educate them on not just the benefits of manufacturing, but the full spread, if you will, in terms of the supply chain, but also upstream in terms of the dealer networks. And my argument about if you don't have assembly, you probably don't have anything else, because eventually it all goes away. An assembly plant is the nucleus. Manufacturing is the nucleus for it all, so to speak. We are in such an exciting period in terms of our industry, in terms of new technology, whether it's automated vehicles, autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles. These things, we obviously, certainly the companies I represent all have engineering facilities here, research and development. They've entered into some very significant and groundbreaking partnerships with software companies, artificial intelligence, and opened up new centers in Ontario and even across Canada, including partnerships with universities. Well, these are the very people who run the companies who are responsible for literally tens of thousands of jobs. And not only do they have the commitment to those people, but they've got a commitment to their parent corporations to deliver product and deliver it on schedule, and to take care of the investments that they've made in this country. Those are the people who, if anybody knew what the ramifications were or would be, it was those people. You don't know until you know. Part of being a responsible, company and business is doing your homework, looking at what the risks are, looking at what the response to those risks may be, and hopefully, one, you've identified the risks and you responded appropriately. All companies, for that matter. You've got to invest in your plants. You've got to, make sure that those plants are not only operating at full capacity, but they're doing it effectively, efficiently. The way you get there is through continuous improvement, but also ongoing investment in the facility itself. If you don't do that, then that facility starts to lose ground in terms of its effectiveness and its efficiencies, and ultimately whether it would be competitive with other sister plants that they compete with in other jurisdictions. But once you enter into that downward vortex, it's very difficult to get out of that. This is all part of the assessment of the future. I think Canada held up very well. Not only did it set its objectives very clearly at the outset, the line in the sand and so forth, they reached out to industry to help them understand, if they put forward a proposal, what the ramifications of that proposal or concept might be. When you go into negotiation, then it's best to know the answers to the questions you anticipate. I think they did that well, and reaching out to industry was exemplary. Having the bilateral with Mexico, I think, might have been a little twist that maybe they didn't fully anticipate, or anybody anticipate for that matter. But in the end, maybe the Mexicans were able to negotiate some things that ultimately were beneficial to us. So they stuck to their guns. And yes, maybe not everybody's happy and all sectors are happy, but I think when you net it all out, this is something which will be better for Canada than no agreement at all, that's for sure.